In the winter of 1887, while the rail yard men stacked ties and reinforced their snow brakes against the coming freeze, a 17-year-old boy named Joshua was doing something they called suicide. He was dragging a tattered wool blanket and a bucket of clay into the rusted-out shell of an abandoned boiler tank. Night after night, as temperatures plunged, he sealed the iron seams with frozen fingers. Travelers swore the kid would freeze solid before sunrise. But Joshua wasn't just hiding from the cold. He was testing a desperate idea, and the ice storm screaming down from the mountain would be his only witness. Becoming a ghost on the rails was not the plan. Joshua had been cast out in the brutal autumn of 1887 with nothing but the coat on his back, a bucket of clay, and a secret he'd learned watching engine fireboxes stay warm for hours after the train pulled away. The rusted boiler tank abandoned behind the switch yard had been a joke to the men who worked there, a frozen iron tomb for fools. But for Joshua, it was a second chance. He lined the curved walls with salvaged felt and river clay, carving a chimney through the corroded top while the wind bit through holes in his gloves. No one expected him to live. No one except the storm itself, which was already rolling down from the mountain to prove whether a forgotten boiler tank could become the only safe room in town. The rail yard at milepost 37 was not a place people went to live. It was a place people passed through, a brutal junction where the timber trains met the coal runs, and the wind never stopped cutting across the frozen river bend. The men who worked the switchboards drank their coffee black and their whiskey neat, and they did not ask questions about strays. That winter, the stray was a boy nobody remembered by name. They just called him Ghost. Weeks earlier, Joshua had still belonged somewhere. He was the youngest son of a failed homesteader who had dragged his family into the Northern Territory on promises of cheap land and mild winters. The promises were lies. By November, his father was dead of a lung sickness that turned his cough to wet gravel. His mother had been gone since spring, buried under a rough wooden cross behind a claim that never produced. Joshua's older brother took over the family wagon and made it clear there was no room for a second mouth. The words were not spoken with cruelty. They were spoken with survival. The boy had until sunset to find another roof. He walked 12 miles that first night with his father's old coat wrapped tight, carrying a salvaged bucket of clay, a hammer, and a handful of bent nails. He headed toward the rail depot because trains meant work, and work meant maybe a dry corner to sleep in. He found the boiler tank 2 mornings later, half buried in frozen mud behind the old switching shed. It was a monstrous thing, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, rusted through in a dozen spots but still holding its curved iron shape. The stencil on the side read Patterson Locomotive Works, 1864, and below it someone had scrawled in chalk, "Dead since the flood." To the yard men it was scrap. To Joshua it was the first solid walls he had seen in 3 days. The foreman of the yard, a hard-shouldered man named Calloway, spotted him the morning Joshua first crawled inside. Calloway was not cruel, just practical. He knew what happened to kids who squatted in rail yard junk. He'd fished 3 frozen bodies from boiler cars in the last 5 years. He gave Joshua a single look, then turned away. "The tank won't save you when the ice comes," he said, his breath a white cloud in the morning air. Nothing made of iron ever saved anyone in a freeze. But Joshua wasn't listening to the foreman. He was listening to the silence inside the tank when the wind hammered against the outer shell. It felt different. It felt like the way his father's old barn had felt. The one winter they insulated the loft with clay and straw and the warmth held for hours. His father had taught him one thing worth remembering. The engine fireboxes stayed warm long after the train pulled away because iron held heat when it was lined properly. Iron alone was a cold death sentence. Iron lined with felt and clay, that was something else entirely. So Joshua began. The work was slow and it bled him. He gathered cast-off felt from the cargo platform, discarded packing material that the merchants threw into heaps near the freight depot. He mixed the river clay with water from a frozen creek, breaking the ice with stones until his hands were numb. He climbed inside the tank on his hands and knees, pressing clay into every seam and crack until the rusty shell began to look less like scrap and more like a sealed pod. The curved shape mattered more than he understood at first. Wind hitting a flat wall slammed into it full force. Wind hitting a curved surface sheared away, lost its shape, became tired. The boiler tank was not just shelter. It was a shape designed to resist pressure from inside and out. At first, no one in the village took him seriously. The village was a frontier stop called Blackthorn, 3 streets of false front stores and a church with a cracked bell. The people there knew hard winters and they knew desperate people. A boy living in a boiler tank was just another tragedy to ignore. Some of the rail workers placed bets on how long before he'd be found frozen. One old trapper named McCready told him straight to his face, "You're building your own coffin, son. Only difference is it's made of iron." But Joshua kept working. He shaped a chimney out of salvaged stovepipe, poking through the top of the tank where a safety valve had once been. He built a small hearth at the base using flat stones from the river. By the end of the first week, the tank had a door, a heavy iron hatch that once sealed a firebox, and a single narrow window covered with dried animal gut, a trick he'd learned from a trader. Inside, the space was no larger than a hunter's tent, but it was his. And then the weather reports began drifting into Blackthorn like a warning bell heard from miles off. The mountain telegraph line came alive with news of a low-pressure front building over the northern peaks, the kind of storm that formed fast and hit hard, dropping sheets of freezing rain that coated everything in inches of solid ice. The old-timers in town called it the glass maker. They'd seen ice storms before. They knew what happened to shacks and lean-tos, and poor insulation when the wind turned freezing rain into a sledgehammer. The night before the storm, Calloway walked out to the boiler tank one last time. He stood in the dark with a lantern swinging from his hand, watching Joshua seal a final seam with clay. "You better pray that chimney draws right," Calloway said, his voice lower than before. "If it backs up with smoke, you won't wake up tomorrow." Then he handed Joshua a wool blanket and walked away without another word. As Joshua crawled inside and pulled the hatch shut, the first drops of freezing rain began to fall. The sound on the iron roof was like small stones. He sat in the dark, listening to the wind shift, feeling the clay at the seams begin to firm up as the cold found the edges. He had no way of knowing whether the tank would hold, whether the chimney would draw, whether the ice would crush or protect. But he had done what no one else in Blackthorn had thought to do. He had made a fortress out of something the world had thrown away. Now the real test was coming. And the storm did not care that he was only 17. The ice storm arrived not with a gentle tapping, but as a sudden wave of frozen bullets. Freezing rain hit the boiler tank's iron shell, and the sound inside became a roar like 1,000 hammers striking at once. Joshua sat with his back pressed against the curved wall, watching the small hearth fire flicker as the storm hammered overhead. For the first few hours, the chimney drew steady. Thin gray smoke spiraled upward through the stovepipe, carrying the sharp scent of burning pine. The clay sealing the seams held firm, and the temperature inside the tank remained bearable, not warm but alive. He wrapped himself in the blanket Calloway had given him and listened. But ice storms are not straightforward enemies. They build, they layer, they transform everything they touch. By midnight, the freezing rain had coated the boiler tank in a shining shell nearly 2 inches thick. The old iron groaned beneath the added weight. Outside, the world of Blackthorn was disappearing. Telegraph wires snapped under the ice load and fell hissing into the drifts. The church bell cracked from the silent pressure of frozen rain that had seeped into its iron and expanded. One by one, the wooden roofs of the village began to fail. The mercantile collapsed first, its flat timber roof unable to shed the accumulating ice. Then the boarding house where 4 rail workers had been sleeping came down with a sound like a wagon being crushed. 3 of the men crawled free. The 4th did not. Inside the tank, Joshua could hear only the roaring. He did not know about the destruction. He did not know that Blackthorn was being dismantled piece by piece. His world had shrunk to the narrow iron cylinder, the flickering fire, and the terrifying possibility that the chimney might ice over. The stovepipe jutted upward only 3 feet from the curved roof, and he had seen how freezing rain could seal a narrow opening. If the cap iced shut, smoke would fill the tank within minutes. He would not feel it happen. His eyes would simply close and never open again. Near 1 in the morning, the flame in the hearth began to gutter. Joshua noticed it first as a dimming, the orange glow pulling back into the coals, the smoke thickening rather than rising. He looked up toward the ceiling, panic tightening his chest. The chimney was dying. Without hesitation, he pushed the heavy iron hatch open and climbed out into the storm. The cold struck him like a physical blow. Freezing rain hammered his face and instantly crusted his eyelashes with ice. The iron roof was a sheet of solid glass. He crawled upward on his hands and knees, gripping the curved shell with fingers that quickly lost feeling. The chimney cap was completely sealed, a solid dome of ice. He struck at it with the hammer from his father's old coat, pounding until the ice cracked and fell away, clearing the vent. Smoke billowed past him in a sudden rush. He nearly slipped, descending back to the hatch. Inside, soaked and shaking, he fed the fire until the flames returned strong. He would make that climb 4 more times before dawn. In the village, Calloway had survived the collapse of the boarding house by being elsewhere. He had spent the evening in the Switch Tower, a tall, narrow building that swayed dangerously in the wind but had not yet buckled. From its high windows, he watched the town die. He saw the mercantile roof fold. He saw the livery stable's walls cave inward, crushing horses still in their stalls. And he saw the shape of the boiler tank out near the back tracks, a dark curved hump covered in ice but still standing, still intact. The boy was still in there. Calloway climbed down from the tower and began pushing through knee-deep slush toward the rail yard, calling for anyone still alive to follow. 3 men joined him. One was the old trapper McCready, who had mocked Joshua to his face. Another was a young brakeman named Ellis who had a broken arm from the boarding house collapse. The third was a freight handler with a bloody gash across his forehead. They moved through the storm like figures in a dream, leaning into the wind, their clothes stiffening with ice as they walked. They reached the boiler tank just as Joshua emerged for the 3rd time to clear the chimney. He saw them coming through the white haze, 4 dark shapes staggering toward him, and he understood immediately why they were there. The village was gone. McCready was the first to speak, his voice a raw shout against the wind. "Is it warm in there, boy?" Joshua looked at the old trapper who had said he was building his own coffin. Then he pulled the hatch open wide. "Get inside," he said. "All of you." 5 men inside a boiler tank meant no room to stretch, no private space, no comfort. They sat shoulder to shoulder around the small hearth, breathing the same tight air while the ice storm continued its relentless assault. McCready sat directly across from Joshua, his back against the curved wall, his eyes studying the sealed seams, the chimney construction, the way the fire drew cleanly. He said nothing for a long while. Then he muttered low enough that only the boy could hear, "I was wrong. This iron coffin of yours is the only thing left standing." But their real test was only beginning. Around 4 in the morning, the freezing rain stopped and the wind shifted. This should have been a relief, but Calloway recognized the change immediately. He had lived through the great ice storm of 1876, and he knew what came next. The temperature dropped sharply, turning the layers of wet ice into solid stone. Everything that had been coated now became encased. The boiler tank, which had been shedding ice reasonably because of its curved shape and internal heat, now faced a new threat. The ice on its outer shell hardened into a single massive carapace. The iron groaned deeply, a low shudder that vibrated through the men inside. The tank was contracting in the cold. If it contracted too fast, the rivets could shear. Calloway looked at Joshua and said, "We need more fire." They fed the hearth until the flames roared against the curved ceiling, the heat radiating outward to keep the iron warm enough to resist. But the chimney was drawing so hard now that the sound became a high whine. Ellis, the brakeman, stared upward with wide eyes. "That pipe's going to fail," he whispered. Joshua was already moving toward the hatch. He had cleared it each time with a hammer. This time he would try something new. He came back inside carrying a handful of coarse salt he had stolen from the freight depot days earlier, a mistake that now became salvation. He scattered the salt around the chimney cap's rim, letting the ice melt away in a slow hiss. The chimney stabilized. McCready shook his head slowly. This kid thought of everything, he said. Morning never really came. The ice storm left the sky a uniform gray, a lid of cloud that refused to break. But the village of Blackthorn was revealed in full daylight horror. Every wooden structure had collapsed. The switch tower leaned at a dangerous angle. The church bell lay in the frozen mud, still attached to a chunk of its broken steeple. The rail yard was a wasteland of splintered ties and overturned flat cars. The only building that showed no damage, save for a coating of ice, was the boiler tank. It stood like a monument to survival in the middle of disaster. By midday, other survivors began emerging from root cellars and stone foundations where they had hidden. They gathered in the rail yard, drawn by the thin column of smoke rising from the tank's chimney. Among them was a representative from the railroad, a district supervisor named Harkness who had ridden in on a horse that was half dead from the ice. He had expected to find the yard completely ruined, the tank a pile of frozen scrap. Instead, he found a boy who had turned it into a shelter. Harkness stood in front of the tank's iron hatch, staring at the sealed seams, the chimney, the valve-turned window. He did not ask how. He asked one quiet question. "How many people fit in there?" Joshua answered from the hatchway. "5 so far." Harkness looked back at the ruined village, then at the intact tank. Something shifted behind his eyes. The railroad would need watchmen. They would need men who could survive at remote depots, who could turn scrap into shelter, who could face a storm and not die. He had not come looking for an employee, but he had found one. Then, as the survivors huddled around the tank planning their next moves, a low, grinding groan echoed across the rail yard. It was not the tank. It was the switch tower, its ice-laden beams finally giving way. The structure tipped, shattering as it struck the frozen ground, and the force of its fall sent a shockwave through the ice crust. A deep crack appeared in the layer beneath the tank's foundation, a crack that ran directly toward the tracks. The boiler tank shifted 2 inches to the right, then settled. Everyone froze. Joshua looked down at the dirt floor inside the tank and saw the crack was widening there too. The tank had held against the storm, but the ground was failing now, and if the foundation gave way completely, the iron cylinder would tip, crushing everyone inside and snuffing the fire that had kept them alive. The storm's last threat was not from above. It was from below. The crack was a living thing. It split the frozen dirt floor from the western edge of the tank to the hearth stones, widening with a sound like a dry branch snapping underwater. McCready pressed his hand against the ground and felt it shifting, a deep vibration that meant the earth beneath them was turning to slush. "The heat," he said, looking at Joshua. "The heat from the fire is melting the permafrost under us. The tank's starting to sink." Calloway was already bracing his shoulders against the curved wall as if that could hold back an entire cylinder of iron. The 5 men inside watched the crack creep toward the hearth. If the stones shifted, the fire would scatter across the dirt floor and ignite the felt lining. They would be trapped in a burning iron oven. Joshua grabbed the clay bucket and began stuffing the gap, his hands working blind while the tank groaned around him. But clay alone could not stop the earth from swallowing them. The real fight was outside. He pushed open the hatch. The ice storm had not weakened. Freezing rain still fell, but now it mixed with a new sound, a low, gut-deep roar that came from the north where the frozen river bent around the rail yard. The ice jam that had been building for days had finally buckled under the pressure of rising water. The river was breaking. Calloway climbed out behind him and stared toward the sound. His face went pale. "That's a flood surge," he shouted. "It's coming across the yard." The 2 of them worked in a frenzy, while the other men fed the fire and watched the crack. Joshua grabbed the long iron bar he had once used to pry open the rusted hatch and drove it into the frozen ground at the edge of the tank's foundation, trying to wedge the cylinder in place. Calloway hauled stones from the old switching shed foundation, passing them down to McCready and Ellis, who stacked them against the sinking side. The ice rain hammered their backs and froze their hair into helmets. The distant roar grew louder. Then they saw it, a dark sheet of water churning with chunks of broken ice, spreading across the rail yard like a second storm rolling sideways. It hit the tank with a force that knocked Calloway off his feet and sent Joshua sliding across the iron roof. The water was freezing cold, the kind of cold that stops your lungs. Inside the tank, the water poured through the crack in the floor, filling the space with a sudden hiss. The hearth fire spat and steamed. Ellis grabbed burning sticks and held them above his head while McCready and the freight handler belayed water with their bare hands, throwing it out the narrow valve window. The water rose to their ankles, then their shins, soaking through boots and wool. But the tank's curved shape did something the flood had not anticipated. The water pressure pushed inward evenly, and with the stones Calloway had stacked, the sinking slowed. The cylinder did not tip. Instead, it began to settle slowly back into the softening ground like a ship shifting in its berth. Outside, Joshua crawled back to the hatch, gasping. The water was already receding, the surge passing on toward the lower tracks where it would pour into the river again. But the damage was done. The ground beneath the tank was now half mud, half ice, unstable in a way no one could fix in the middle of a storm. Joshua looked at Calloway, shivering uncontrollably. Calloway shook his head. It's going to settle one way or the other. Either the mud freezes and locks us in place, or it doesn't and we keep sinking. All we've got is the cold. And the cold came. Not gradually, but as a sudden drop that turned the freezing rain into razor-sharp snow pellets. The temperature fell so fast that the water pooling inside the tank began to stiffen around their boots. Joshua ordered everyone out of the hatch for one terrible minute while he packed the remaining clay into the floor crack from the outside, using the floodwater itself to set the seal. The water on the ground was already forming a thick skin of ice. As he pressed the clay into place, the cold flash froze it in moments, turning the patch into a solid plug. When he climbed back inside, the floor was no longer soft. The mud had become stone. The tank held. The 5 men sat in the dark, listening. The wind outside had changed pitch again, now a high keening as the storm exhausted itself against the mountain. The hearth fire, which had nearly drowned, began to burn steadier, fed by the last dry wood they had. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that the storm had not already said for them. They had survived ice, flood, and the earth trying to swallow them. The boiler tank, a piece of scrap that had been left to rust, had become the only thing between them and a frozen death. By the following afternoon, the sky began to lighten. The wind dropped. The snow stopped. The world outside the hatch was unrecognizable. The village of Blackthorn was gone, not simply damaged but erased. The ice glaze had collapsed every roof, snapped every timber. The switch tower lay in a heap of splintered beams. The church was a pile of wet wood and broken glass. The rail yard was a desert of frozen mud and scattered cargo. Boxcars flipped like toys, ties buried under feet of dirty ice. Only the boiler tank remained standing, its curved iron shell shining under a thin coat of ice, the chimney still breathing smoke. Harkness, the district supervisor, returned on foot with a party from the next town over who had finally dug their way through the pass. They found the survivors clustered around the tank, the 5 men who had lived through the worst of it and several other townsfolk who had sheltered in root cellars. Harkness walked around the tank slowly, inspecting the chimney, the clay-sealed seams, the makeshift window, the iron bar wedged against the foundation. He saw the stones stacked against the base, evidence of the battle against the sinking. He saw the boy who had done it, standing by the hatch with a wool blanket around his shoulders and frost still crusted in his hair. McCready stepped forward before Harkness could speak. "You see this tank," he said, his voice rough. "This kid built a shelter that outlasted every building in town. He pulled us inside when we had nowhere to go. He cleared the chimney in the middle of the storm with his bare hands. And when the ground cracked and the river broke, he plugged the hole with clay and froze it solid. I've spent 30 winters in these mountains, and I've never seen anything like it." Harkness looked at Joshua. The boy did not look like a hero. He looked tired, hungry, and impossibly young. "How did you know the curved shape would hold?" Harkness asked. Joshua shrugged beneath the blanket. "It's like a firebox," he said. "An engine's firebox is round inside for a reason. The heat spreads even. The pressure stays equal. I figured cold would work the same way if I sealed it right." Harkness stared at him for a long moment, then looked at the destroyed switch tower, the ruined boarding house, and the long stretch of track that would need to be guarded through the rest of the winter. The railroad needed men at remote depots. They needed watchmen who could survive alone, who could turn whatever they found into a shelter, who would not freeze when the storms came. He had just found one. "I've got a job for you," Harkness said. The words hung in the cold air. A job, the railroad. Joshua tightened the blanket around his shoulders and stared at Harkness, waiting for the catch. The supervisor's face gave nothing. "You'll be watchman at milepost 37, Harkness said. "This tank is your station now. Keep the switches clear, flag the timber trains, and don't freeze. You'll draw pay starting the first of the month." It was not charity. It was a cold, practical decision. The railroad needed eyes on the remote stretch of track, and the only structure that had survived the ice storm was the very boiler tank everyone had called a coffin. Joshua accepted with a single nod. He had no other choice and he knew it, but something else had shifted inside him too. The tank was no longer just shelter. It was proof. Proof that a curved iron wall lined with felt and clay could defy the worst winter the frontier had seen in 20 years. Proof that a boy without a home could build one from scrap when every carpenter in town had failed. And in the days that followed, as the ice melted and the mud hardened, proof came walking down the rail line again and again to see the tank with their own eyes. The first visitors were the survivors themselves. They came to thank him, to drop off bread or coffee, to ask how he had sealed the seams so tight that freezing rain never crept through. McCready, the old trapper who had once called the tank a coffin, returned every morning for a week. He brought a notebook and charcoal pencil and drew careful sketches of the chimney cap, the salt trick, the way Joshua had wedged the iron bar against the sinking foundation. "I've been trapping these mountains since before your father was born," McCready admitted, "and I never thought to build rounded, always built square like everyone else. Square walls take the wind full in the chest. This thing, it lets the wind slide off like water off a duck's back." He tucked the notebook inside his coat. "I'm building one of these up at my winter camp. Only credit I'll give is to a 17-year-old. Then came the men from the next town, the ones who had dug through the pass with shovels and mules. They arrived expecting to find a mass grave at Blackthorn. Instead, they found a rusted boiler tank still breathing smoke, 5 men alive inside, and a boy calmly patching the last cracks in the clay lining. The lead digger, a barrel-chested foreman named Sully, walked around the tank 3 times without speaking. He knocked on the iron shell with his knuckles. He climbed onto the roof and inspected the chimney. When he climbed down, he looked at Harkness. "This is how we ought to be building all the remote depots," Sully said. "Cheaper than timber, stronger than stone, and the ice can't get a grip on a curve. Why the hell isn't the railroad doing this already?" Harkness had no answer, but he wrote a report that night, sitting by the lantern inside the tank while Joshua fed the hearth. The report described the destruction of Blackthorn, the survival of the boiler tank, and the remarkable ingenuity of the boy who had transformed it. He recommended the railroad explore using decommissioned boiler tanks as watchman shelters along exposed stretches of the line, particularly where winter winds came down from the mountains and timber structures repeatedly collapsed under ice loads. It was a radical idea. It was also impossible to ignore. Within a month, Joshua had become a quiet legend. Not famous, never famous. The frontier had no newspapers to make him so. But his name passed along the rail line from crew to crew, and the phrase Joshua's tank became shorthand for turning nothing into something. Passengers on the timber trains sometimes caught a glimpse of it as they passed. A dark iron hump against the white prairie, smoke curling from its chimney, a single light flickering in the valve-turned window. It looked ancient and permanent, like a creature that had grown from the frozen ground. Joshua himself did not change much. He was still lean, still young, still carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had learned early that the world owed him nothing. He rose before dawn each day, checked the switches, and kept the signal flags flying. But when he wasn't working, he kept improving the tank. He built a small wooden porch over the hatch to shield against driving snow. He added a second hearth stone and a proper chimney damper fashioned from an old brake plate. He scavenged more felt from the freight depot and layered it thicker along the walls, mixing the clay with crushed straw this time for better insulation. The tank grew warmer, drier, more like a home than any structure he had slept in since his mother died. That winter, the real test came. Not an ice storm this time, but 60-mile-an-hour winds and a straight blizzard that lasted 9 days. The wooden watchman shacks at other mileposts collapsed or drifted over. 2 men froze to death. At milepost 37, Joshua rode out the blizzard without a single night of frostbite. The curved iron shed the wind, the clay lining held the heat, and the chimney drew steady even when the snow piled higher than the hatch. When the blizzard finally broke, Harkness rode out to inspect the damage along the line. He found every timber shelter wrecked. He found the boiler tank intact, its occupant alive and calmly boiling coffee. That spring, the railroad sent a carpenter and 2 blacksmiths to milepost 37 with instructions to build a permanent watchman station exactly to Joshua's specifications. They used an old locomotive boiler shell, cut it in half, and lined it with plastered clay and felt. They added a proper door, a cast-iron stove, a window with double-paned glass. The design was so effective that by autumn, 2 more tanks had been installed at other exposed posts. Joshua helped build one of them himself, showing the men how to seal the seams, how to angle the chimney so the wind never drove smoke back inside, how to mount earth around the base for stability. The other watchmen called the new shelters Joshua tanks, and the name stuck. Decades later, railroad workers still use the term for any curved iron shelter pressed into service along a remote line. But the story did not end with a job and a warm place to sleep. The ice storm had taken more from Blackthorn than buildings. It had taken lives, erased homes, scattered families. In the slow rebuilding that followed, the survivors had to decide what kind of town they wanted to become. The old church was rebuilt with stone. The mercantile rose again with a pitched roof designed to shed ice rather than catch it. And on the eastern edge of the rail yard, the original boiler tank remained. Not as a curiosity, but as a reminder. People who had lost everything walked past it and remembered that a boy with no family, no money, and no training had saved 5 men because he had paid attention to the way heat moved inside an engine firebox. McCready kept his promise. He built a round shelter at his trap camp, smaller than the tank but curved in the same way. He survived that winter without a single frozen limb, the first time in 30 years. When spring came, he walked all the way back to milepost 37 and sat with Joshua beside the hearth, the 2 of them drinking coffee from tin cups. "I spent my whole life fighting winter with straight lines," McCready said. "You don't fight a storm. You let it exhaust itself against nothing." Joshua didn't answer because the old trapper had just said everything. Years later, when the railroad expanded into the Northern Territories, the company's engineering manual included a section on curved iron shelter construction for remote posts. The illustration in the manual looked exactly like Joshua's boiler tank, down to the valve-turned window and the chimney damper made from a brake plate. The manual did not mention his name. But the men who read it and built those shelters learned the story anyway, passed along from older watchmen over shared meals in those very same round rooms. A story about the winter of 1887, when the worst ice storm in memory flattened an entire town, and the only thing left standing was a piece of scrap with a boy inside. And there was a final detail that no one learned until much later. The boiler tank Joshua had stumbled upon was not just any forgotten piece of junk. The stenciled mark, Patterson Locomotive Works, 1864, connected it to the engine that had once pulled the first passenger train into the territory, a famous locomotive called the Northern Dawn. The engine had been scrapped years before, its boiler sold for salvage and left to rust behind the switching shed. A machine that had once carried pioneers into the frontier had become, in its death, the shelter that saved 5 men from a storm. The boy who saw a home inside that rusted shell had been carried by that same engine's legacy all along. Joshua never married, never owned a house. He worked for the railroad for 41 years, retiring in 1928 with a pension and a small medal from the company. When he died, the original boiler tank was still standing at milepost 37, half buried in prairie grass and painted with a single line of whitewash. Joshua's Place, 1887. The railroad kept it as a historical marker long after the depot closed. Travelers sometimes stopped their cars along the old track bed to photograph it, wondering why a rusted iron cylinder still stood alone in an empty field. The answer was written in the ice itself. Joshua had not conquered the storm. He had understood it better than anyone else, and in that understanding, he had built something the wind could not break. Not because he was a genius, not because he had special training, but because he had been willing to listen to the groaning of iron, to the whisper of smoke in a chimney, to the way cold moved differently through a curve than a wall. The same storm that killed his town had taught him how to survive, and the lesson he left behind was not about boilers or clay or felt. It was about paying attention, because the world is always speaking to those who bother to hear. That is the real secret most people never learn. The frontier didn't reward the strongest backs or the thickest walls. It rewarded the ones who paid attention. Joshua didn't have money, family, or any special training. What he had was a memory of how heat moved through a firebox, a bucket of clay, and the willingness to sit alone in the dark listening to the way wind sheared off a curved iron wall. While the whole town built square and died square, he built round and lived. Think about what that means for a moment. All of Blackthorn's carpentry, all its seasoned timber and iron nails, failed because the builders followed the same logic everyone had followed for generations. They built walls to block the storm, but the ice didn't need to break through walls. It just needed to pile on top until the weight did the work. Flat roofs, vertical faces, clean right angles, these were invitations to destruction. A curved iron shell offered no invitation. The ice had nowhere to grip, no flat surface to crush. The wind hit it and lost its shape, exactly as wind loses its shape when it hits a round stone in a river. Joshua didn't outfight the storm. He outthought it by working with the physics the storm itself obeyed. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. How many of the problems we face today are being fought with straight lines when the solution is a curve? How many industries are still building flat roofs against ice storms, metaphorically speaking, because that's the way it's always been done? The Watchman shacks that collapsed weren't built by stupid people. They were built by competent, experienced frontiersmen who simply never questioned the shape of their walls. One boy, forced to sleep in scrap because he had no other choice, questioned everything. That single act of questioning saved 5 lives, changed railroad engineering, and left a lesson that outlasted the railroad itself. The boiler tank still stands. Or at least it stood long enough for people to photograph it, write about it, pass the story down. And every time a winter storm rolls through the old rail yard, the wind still moves differently around that spot. The curve still works. The principle hasn't aged a single day. Clay and felt may not be modern building materials, but the physics of a curved surface shedding pressure, that's timeless. Whether it's an ice storm in 1887 or a hurricane in 2024, the wind doesn't care what year it is. It only cares about the shape standing in its way. So the question isn't really about Joshua. It's about you. When you face your own version of the ice storm, the thing that threatens to collapse everything you've built, are you going to build a taller wall? Or are you willing to listen to the shape the storm itself is asking for? Joshua's answer was a rusted boiler tank that everyone else called junk. What's yours? Subscribe now to join us for the next incredible true story of survival and ingenuity. Because the world is full of forgotten heroes whose ideas could change everything, and we're just getting started.